Good evening, welcome to the show. What you're about to hear is not an exaggeration, and if it's even partly true, it's staggering. In the last 24 hours, across the length of Russia's front line in Ukraine, Ukrainian sources say Russian forces have taken up to 18,400 casualties. 18,400 in a single day. That is not a normal bad day at the office for the Russian army, on most days since this war began. Even the worst official estimates have ranged in the hundreds, maybe a little over 1,000. This number blows straight past those baselines, and that means even the most cautious analyst has to stop and look twice. Tonight, we're not just going to repeat that figure and move on. We're going to ask, where does it come from? What does it actually include? And what would losses on that scale mean for Russia's ability to keep fighting? Most people will just share the meme. You're here because you want to understand what a day like this really implies for Russia's entire front line. So let's start with the most basic question: where does a number like 18,400 even come from? Ukrainian General Staff publishes daily estimates of Russian losses across all sectors of the front: killed, wounded, missing, and those so badly damaged they're out of the fight. Sometimes, when a major offensive wave crashes against multiple Ukrainian positions at once, those daily figures spike. The 18,400 figure appears to be an aggregation of such reports tied to one especially brutal 24-hour window, possibly including not only frontline troops, but mobilized reserves chewed up before they ever reach their objectives. It almost certainly mixes KIA, DUIA, and MIA into one casualty basket. On an average hard day, Ukrainian reports might claim 600, 900, maybe 500 Russian casualties. This is more than 10 times that. This isn't attrition. It's what attrition looks like on steroids. Now, we have to be honest about the fog of war and propaganda. These are estimates from one side in a conflict, and independent verification is difficult. But even if you shave that number down by half or more, you are still looking at a single day that stands out as extreme. To understand how a number like 18,400 is even possible, you have to look at where the line lit up. This wasn't one disaster in one town. It was multiple fires breaking through the wallpaper at once. Along the Avdiivka-Donetsk axis, Russian forces threw wave after wave of infantry at long-prepared Ukrainian positions, trying to chew their way closer to the city's last defensive belts. North of there, on the Lyman-Kupiansk line, mechanized columns probed and pushed, looking for soft spots in wooded terrain that Ukraine has turned into overlapping fields of fire. In southern Zaporizhzhia, near Robotyne and Verbov, Moscow tried again to regain ground lost earlier in the year, sending armored vehicles back onto roads and tracks already mapped and mined. On the left bank of the Dnipro near Kherson, assault groups in boats and light armor tried to dislodge Ukrainian bridgeheads under constant drone observation. Ukrainian reports and Western assessments for this period all point to an unusually high number of engagements across almost the entire front, dozens of clashes, many involving company or battalion-sized forces. When you stack that kind of simultaneous pressure onto entrenched, well-supported Ukrainian defenses, the result isn't a single spectacular failure. It's many smaller catastrophes happening at once, each contributing its own piece to a very large and very grim total. Numbers like these don't appear out of thin air. They're created by tactics that punish every bad decision. Ukraine has spent months turning key sectors of the front into layered defensive machines. First come the minefields and anti-tank ditches, laid in overlapping bands that slow and break up advancing units. Behind them sit trenches and hardened strongpoints dug into high ground or tree lines, positioned so that any Russian force that clears one obstacle is immediately exposed to fire from another angle. Above all of this, drones never stop flying. Small FPV drones stalk individual vehicles and assault groups, marking targets for artillery, dropping munitions directly into open hatches, or forcing troops to ground at the worst possible moments. Artillery batteries guided by those drones don't have to search for targets. They're handed precise coordinates again and again. In at least one sector, Russian commanders reportedly ordered repeated waves down the same approach road, trying to push the line by sheer persistence. To Moscow, these were bold attacks meant to show momentum. To Ukrainian artillery crews, they were coordinates repeating on a schedule. Each wave hit the same pre-sighted kill zones. Mines first, then shells, then drones picking off whatever survived. When that pattern is multiplied across several hotspots in the same night, the result is not just repelled attacks. It is a meat grinder that turns Russia's mass into catastrophic loss. Behind the number 18,400 are people the Kremlin treated as expendable. Many of those thrown into these assaults were poorly trained mobilized soldiers rushed through a few weeks of drills and sent straight to the line. Others came from the so-called Storm Z units. Prison recruits promised shorter sentences if they survived a tour that most never finish. Still others are contract soldiers who signed up under economic pressure or deception and then found themselves ordered forward in what Russian soldiers grimly call meat storms. Human waves sent against fortified positions with little armor and less support, minimal training, bad equipment, drunk or absent junior officers, and the constant presence of Ukrainian drones overhead. That is the reality they walked into. What happens to an army when whole battalions disappear in a night? Russia is the aggressor in this war. These attacks are a direct consequence of the Kremlin's decision to invade and keep invading. But the men chewed up in assaults like these are still human beings, sons and fathers and brothers, sacrificed on the altar of one government's refusal to admit it is losing. Those 18,400 Russian casualties did not arrive at the front alone. They came with steel and electronics that also did not make it home. Ukrainian General Staff reports for that same 24-hour window speak of dozens of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles destroyed or disabled, columns caught in minefields and kill zones, then finished off by FPV drones and anti-tank missiles. Artillery pieces and multiple launch rocket systems were knocked out by counter-battery fire. In some sectors, several guns from the same battery were destroyed within minutes once their firing positions were fixed by drones. Hundreds of Russian drones, reconnaissance and loitering munitions were also reported lost, whittling away at the eyes and stingers of the front line. Each destroyed tank is one less armored spearhead. Each shredded howitzer is one less tube able to pound Ukrainian trenches tomorrow. Each drone that falls from the sky is one less set of eyes for the next assault. Russia isn't just losing soldiers. It's burning through the tools it needs to keep this war going. A single day like this raises a blunt question: how long can Russia actually keep doing this? Since the first weeks of the invasion, the Kremlin has already burned through much of its original professional force and has resorted to multiple waves of mobilization and covert conscription. Hundreds of thousands of men have been pulled from civilian life, often from poorer, more remote regions, under laws that keep tightening and contracts that are harder and harder to escape. At the same time, reports from inside Russia point to growing draft evasion, men leaving the country, people paying bribes to stay off lists, and a rising awareness in places like Buryatia, Dagestan, and rural Siberia that their communities are paying a disproportionate price. Western estimates now put total Russian casualties, killed and wounded, well into the hundreds of thousands, a figure that rivals or exceeds the original invasion force. On Kremlin TV, every loss is replaceable, the manpower pool is endless, and the maps always show arrows moving forward. In real life, villages are missing young men, schools are graduating smaller classes, and families are getting third and fourth notifications. How many 18,400 days can Russia absorb before something breaks? Not on the front, but at home. To see why days like this are becoming so costly for Russia, you have to compare the war's opening months with where we are now. Early on, Ukraine was scrambling short on drones, improvising artillery spotting with whatever tools it had, building fortifications on the fly. Today, the picture is different. Ukrainian brigades are saturated with reconnaissance and FPV drones, feeding real-time video into artillery and mortar units that have become far more precise. Counter-battery fire is faster and deadlier, especially with Western radar and fire control systems in the mix. Defensive lines are deeper and better planned, turning key sectors into layered traps. Russia, meanwhile, often fights like it's still 2022, repeating frontal assaults along the same routes, underestimating just how tightly drones and artillery are now integrated on the Ukrainian side. Russia is throwing more meat at the line. Ukraine is throwing more intelligence at it. If a casualty spike like this were a freak accident, it would still be horrific. But the real fear in Moscow and the hope in Kiev is what happens if nights like this stop being rare. If Russia continues to hurl massed assaults against well-prepared Ukrainian defenses, and Ukraine continues to fight with layered fortifications, drones, and precision artillery, future Russian offensives may become shorter, bloodier, and less ambitious. Units that take catastrophic losses in a single 24-hour period are harder to rebuild. Defensive cohesion suffers when survivors no longer trust their commander's orders. Politically, a pattern of 18,400 days would weaken Russia's negotiating posture and could increase quiet internal pressure on the Kremlin, even as it strengthens Western willingness to keep arming Ukraine if they see Russia bleeding heavily for minimal gains. Does a night like this mark a turning point, or just a brutal chapter in a longer grind? At what cost does Putin insist on holding each kilometer? We won't know the full answer tomorrow, but events on this scale inevitably shape how generals plan and how politicians calculate what comes next. Most people will encounter this story as a meme or a stray line in a ticker. Russia loses 18,400 troops in one night, and then it's on to the next outrage. The media cycle rarely has time to unpack where numbers like that come from, what they include, or what they actually look like on the ground. For the men in those trenches, this wasn't a number. It was a night that tore units apart. If you're still here, you're part of a smaller audience that wants to see how casualty statistics connect to trenches and minefields, to drones overhead and decisions made in far-off offices. That means you're better prepared to parse the next round of news, to tell the difference between propaganda and patterns that really matter. If you value that kind of pro-democracy, in-depth coverage, let me know. Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next time the headlines hide more than they reveal. So let's bring this together. In one 24-hour window, Ukrainian sources say Russia lost up to 18,400 troops across multiple sectors, from Avdiivka and Lyman to Zaporizhzhia and the left bank of Kherson, along with tanks, IFVs, artillery, rockets, and swarms of drones. Behind that number are waves of mobilized men and prison units thrown into layered minefields and presided kill zones, while Ukraine fights with better fortifications, better drones, and better coordination with Western systems. This is what Moscow's bleed them with walls doctrine really looks like when it meets an enemy that has learned how to break those walls. It is also a testament to Ukrainian resilience and professionalism. If, and it is a big if, the country keeps getting the support it needs. A regime can pretend numbers are abstract. Families cannot. And if nights like this continue, neither can the war.